Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. I am Mike Rain here, the editor-in-chief for Canadian Musician and Professional Sound Magazines. Just popping in here quickly to do an intro and get us started. Thanks again for joining us. This is a free webinar presented by NWC Webinars. NWC, of course, the publisher of Canadian Musician and Professional Sound Magazines. So today we're doing mixing music, the next step towards finishing your hit production. Your host in just a minute is going to be my colleague and friend, Andrew Leyenhorst. In addition to working on the magazines, Andrew is a graduate of the Ontario Institute of Audio Recording Technology, aka OEART. He has an extensive experience as a producer, engineer, and mixer. Andrew will be joined by our friend, the great Brian Moncarz. Brian has a hell of a track record. He's a Billboard-charting producer and mixer with over 20 years of experience. He's worked with artists like Alice Cooper, Our Lady Peace, the Trews, Julian Taylor, a bunch of others. He's also engineered and mixed on records alongside producers like Bob Ezrin and David Botterill. So we're in good company here, and I know there's going to be just a ton of valuable information that Andrew and Brian are going to be offering. So without further ado, let's get into this because time is limited. Andrew, over to you, man.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thanks to everyone for coming out. I'm excited. And also, Brian, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So to kind of start things off a little bit, I'm going to pick the audience's brain. I've got a quick little poll for you guys just in terms of your own backgrounds in whatever, in terms of what brings you here. So you can select multiple answers here, but yeah, musician, producer, educator, content, just curious. Okay. You guys are wicked fast with the poll responses. Wow. Okay. So yeah, looks like we got a lot of musicians. About 80%-ish musicians, not bad. Okay, cool. So that's that's good to know that, so obviously I guess for musicians, that's one of the things that can kind of be a little bit of a hump is in terms of, you can record things, then there's the next step, which is mixing it, right? And I don't know, so Brian,
yeah,
to you, like the significance of mixing, not only in terms of like, yes, the producer does their job and kind of dresses the song up, but then in your mind, like what is the mixer's responsibility from there?
I think it'll depend from project to project and to a certain extent, but I think overall, like my approach would be, taking what the producer sort of set out to accomplish, and I can figure that out by listening to rough mixes and, looking at their Pro Tools session and then really enhancing, their vision. Yeah. So it's sort of like, maybe an amalgamation of, enhancing their vision and then throwing some of my creative vision into the mix as well, because I find that I get hired a lot to do that because I am a producer as well. And so.
Yeah, and it definitely is one of those things where I feel like, especially now that sort of, it's becoming more and more of a kind of a distinct thing where, we're, especially with like budgets and whatnot, in so many cases, this guy's, the producer will just mix the record and things like that. But overall, it's, again, the idea of, finalizing almost the vision, right? That's kind of what mixing is taking the track and then making it gel is kind of the way that I like to describe it. It's taking the moving parts and all of the elements that are, that make up a song. And then, if the recording is writing a draft of a book, mixing is going to be going in and making all of your little edits in a way. And so let's talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
So the first thing is like, first you want to think about your tools. There's a few different ways to go about it. I tend to mix more in the box. And in the box is a term that basically describes mixing done entirely inside the computer or inside of a DAW, or in your recording software. And then, Brian, I know that your setup is a little bit more advanced. You kind of do more of a hybrid, right?
I do mix hybrid, yeah. So I've got a Burl summing mixer and a Burl mothership interface.
Yeah.
Which basically just gives a little bit of an extra analog vibe to the mix. Certainly, I've done many mixes in the box. Like some of the like the Our Lady Peace record I did was all in the box. The Tea Party stuff was all in the box.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's totally. I mean, it's fun to have the toys, but it's not necessary.
Yeah.
You know? I think for me, it's more about the ears and listening than it is about what tools you have at your disposal. But that being said, I mean, I've been doing it for 20 years, and when I started, I was on a console, and and so I miss turning knobs and pushing buttons and throwing up faders and
the tactile feeling of it for sure.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, but I guess as far as that goes, one of the things that I wanted to talk about was the fact that, the idea that, you can mix in the box or you can do it outside of the box with all that stuff. The nice thing is ultimately the gear is not what makes a mixer. It's going to be kind of understanding more about what the gear does and how you can apply that no matter what you're using it for.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so we'll talk about that a little bit once I get into the demo in terms of things like, your basic effects like compression, EQ, things like chorus, reverbs, delays, kind of spatial effects and what they're for, and sort of how, what we do with them. But and then there's a few other things to keep in mind as well, mainly your room, actually, like room treatment and kind of headphones versus no headphones versus things like that. Because something to keep in mind is that when you're, even in terms of recording, this is something that I covered on my last webinar, is the room you're in, the space you're in will affect how your ears hear things. So there are certain things you want to keep in mind. For example, you don't want to be mixing in a room that's like, full of that, you don't want to be blasting your speakers back into a bunch of windows or, a reflective room made of concrete or anything like that. You want to make sure that your space is, obviously we can't all just have a control room built in our house, but you want to kind of pay attention to certain things like how dead or how reflective the sound is in your room. If you clap and you can hear that clap for a certain amount of time, chances are that room might be a little bit too live. Things like that. Yeah, Brian, what would you have to say about kind of dealing with rooms?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because this year has been, obviously a crazy year. So I've been, I have a mix room in a studio in King City, and the studio's been closed because of COVID, and they decided to kind of, play it safe. And so I haven't been able to go into my mix room. So I moved all my gear home, and I'm actually, I've spent the bulk of this year mixing in my basement.
Okay.
Which is a completely I shouldn't say untreated. I brought some treatment home, but it's a very weird room that's, not treated all that well. But I'm kind of, over 20 years of doing this, I've moved from different studios and different setups, and I'm kind of used to just, knowing how my speakers sound no matter what. And I tend not to mix very loud these days, so I don't have to worry about reflections. And the speakers that I use are, they're smaller speakers.
What do you use?
They're oddballs. They're called Spiral Groove Studio Ones.
Okay.
A mastering engineer friend of mine recommended them to me.
Okay.
I bought them maybe 6 years ago, and I love them. Not great for tracking. They don't have enough power, really. But for sort of quiet mixing,
Mhm.
which I know is kind of unrock and roll. Everyone wants to listen loud, but I find when I mix quieter, my mixes are far more dynamic and jump
Right.
out of the speakers when I do turn it up. So yeah, so I mean, room does play a huge part. I mean, like my control room at the studio that I'm at is fully treated and sounds
Mhm.
great in there. But I've been jumping back and forth. So I spent some of the year there and some of the year in my basement, and kind of screws with your mindset and your ears a little bit, having to go from place to place.
Yeah.
I tend not to mix on headphones. I mean, I've got my headphones that I'll check mixes on, but
Mhm.
I like to hear sort of the relationship of the music coming out of the speakers, and that a
Yeah.
little bit of distance is good. Um, and playing with speaker position for me in my basement especially was a huge deal because the room isn't very treated.
Right.
I had to really play with how far apart and the angle of them as well, because moving speakers an inch in any direction is going to change
It's
how they sound
yeah,
massively.
it's wild. Yeah,
Yeah.
that is definitely one of those things. And so on that note, so if you're setting up, if you're setting up speakers or you have speakers set up, anything like that, and take the opportunity to kind of mess around with adjusting them and see how they sound and just at different orientations and things like that, because chances are, like, if you've got something, for example, like too close to a wall or anything like that, you're going to start getting a lot of rumbling from behind the speakers, things like that, from your low end, because that's something to keep in mind, is that low end propagates. and
It
and
does.
yeah, and it'll, so if you're in certain spaces might amplify that a little bit too much, or could have something called a standing wave, which is basically a certain frequency that's amplified by the reflections in the room kind of bouncing off of each other. Um, so that's something to keep in mind, is that you want to make sure that you're in at least, somewhat of a tame environment, I'll say, especially if you're mixing in speakers, because that way your room isn't going to kind of be as much of a factor in things. But anyway, I'm going to bust open a session here, and we'll go over a few things. So usually in most cases nowadays, like, and I feel like, especially if you're a musician, you're probably gonna, I would take the guess that you're gonna be you're aiming to work and record your own and mix your own stuff. So I'm gonna pull up a session here, which is basically, I'm gonna go through a sort of mock session kind of management thing here for a minute, for starters, because not everything that in some cases you're going to receive stuff from a producer or whatever, and they're just sending you a session and you might have to do some cleanup. I'm sure you've run into that, Brian.
Yes, very often. lots of cleanup.
Yeah. So here again, we see I've just got this is a pretty minimal sort of pop session. It's nothing too crazy, but let me just change my audio device here so you can actually hear what I'm doing. But you'll basically notice, you can kind of see throughout while this initializes, there's just chunks of things everywhere. There's sort of, we got a track up here. This is, these are the main vocals. We've got these kind of just sections all floating around here, and all these little blocks, which is like, ultimately it's not the most organized, especially if you're just trying to go in and get the right sounds and kind of worry about it that way. For me, it's one of those deals where I know where everything is because this is my mess that I made. But typically, as part of a workflow, you want to kind of go through and clean things up. So like the first thing that I've done was, beforehand already, I had all of these sections on the vocal track. They were all separated. But here, for example, I have a left side and a right side harmony for these cases here, to kind of clean things up, for something like that, I can just take these and I'll join them together into a single stereo track. So now I can process both of those with one thing or with one plugin, rather than having to, open 2 instances on 2 tracks and things like that. So then you can go through and just any sort of doubled parts or things like that, or even buses, if you've got like a bunch of different guitars going to something or anything like that. That's the first way to sort of make your session a little bit less of a headache, is you can just go through, consolidate things, clean them up, and make it so that you're not looking at a visceral nightmare to look at. All right, because as you go through and do these, and you can even go take it a step further and just, go whole tracks at once. It's funny, usually my Pro Tools etiquette is much better than my Logic etiquette for whatever reason. I think because I was technically trained in Pro Tools, but I've always just used Logic on my own, so I was more regimented about learning Pro Tools there. But that's something that you can do, is kind of clean things up, go through, and just kind of get rid of as much headache visually as you can, so that it makes it a little bit easier to navigate and less of a headache to just get around and see where things are. Would you do something similar, Brian?
Yeah, I mix in Pro Tools. I'm pretty, I guess, anal about keeping my project, in a presentable way so that I can mix fast.
Yeah.
So I color code, the drums have a color to them, the bass has a color, guitar. So that way I always know, no matter what mix I'm working on, I can scroll through really quick and find what it is that I need to take a look at.
Yeah.
I always set my mixes up in the same way. So
yeah.
I've got like my mix bus and my print track are always at the top of the session, and then I have like my drum effects underneath, and then I have all of the tracks, like starting with the drums down to the vocals, and then under my vocals I have all my other effect tracks,
right?
Like reverbs and parallel compression and delays and things like that.
Cool.
Yeah.
So we'll start here. I'll actually play some music. I'll start kind of by looking at the instrumental here. So basically this is a session that I've loaded up on my office computer that has none of my actual plugins. So I've basically got to kind of rework this thing. And another thing would be something like this, where you're looking at a MIDI track, right? That would be something where, right, this is taking up more processing information than it needs to, because it's a soft synth. That's the type of thing where you want to go in and like actually bounce it down into an audio file so that it's not using unnecessary processing or anything like that. You want to make sure you're managing things like that in terms of your plugins, and anything you can do helps, especially if you don't have a studio computer that's, fully spec'd out to be doing a million things at once. So we'll just wait for that to finish real quick, because if you see with the MIDI here, these are basically just control signals and you sending through a software instrument. But if you do that, now we have actual audio that's not using any more processing than it needs to be for the time being. So let's have a look at the instrumental here. And Brian, can you hear that?
I can, yeah.
All right, excellent. So for starters here, we'll just wait till the drums come in, see how it builds here. So first things first, I don't really like the way that snare is really just kind of popping out. Actually, Yeah, see, it's now way too loud now that I unfroze it, the processing from before. So this is a situation like where, for starters, I usually always start with drums when I'm kind of balancing overall, because my general philosophy for most things, again, it can be genre dependent, but I like to anchor everything around the kick and snare. Where basically, regardless of the section of the song, it's kind of like those are the two elements that you're going to be able to really hear. And so, and especially in pop, as far as because I find, you know, the drums are your foundation. That's where a lot of the power is coming from. So if they're not dialed in where they need to be, I kind of like to think of it as a visual metaphor of like the kick and the snare and usually the cymbals sort of wrap around the rest of the instruments, if that makes sense. And then they're sort of there as the anchor point. What, as far as that type of thing, Brian, what do you like?
I guess not too dissimilar from how you just put it. I almost think of mixing in terms of like your well, I guess mid side, but you know, your center channel versus your left and right, and how you define the bottom end of your mix, you know, will come from the relationship of the side information and how it connects with what you have in the center. You know, so your bottom end is like the kick drum and the bass, but in the center channel, you're also going to have the snare drum and your lead vocal. Mm-hmm. And then on the sides, you know, could be guitars or synths. And, you know, the more bottom end information you have on the sides, then the less sort of bottom you're going to feel from the center.
Yeah.
So those are just things to keep in mind. But yeah, I'm, you know, getting that center, you know, anything that's, when I say center, anything that's panned in the middle in your stereo spectrum, getting that to really jump out of the speakers is the first order of business. So for me, I'll start, you know, usually just I don't solo things per se. I just, you know, I'll start with a rough mix and I'll start tweaking the drums and getting the kick to sound right, but in relationship to the rest of the song usually. Mm-hmm. And snare and then, you know, I'll make sure that I get the vocal into the mix very early on in the process,
right?
Just so I can build around the vocal.
Okay,
as well.
Cool.
Yeah.
So let me try that out a little bit. So again, once we get into, we start out, we've just got this synth bass here, for example, and this is kind of the main synth here. And I'm going to unfreeze these still. Okay, cool. And then we've got this lead that comes in too. And okay, so right away, snare's too loud. That can come down. Yeah, like the whole thing, it's just absolutely murdering the mix bus, especially the drums. So right now, I'm just going to turn the entire drum bus down for starters, because, you know, it just doesn't need to be that loud. Generally, I'll find like myself kind of as I go through a mix, constantly trying to just turn things down as they kind of start getting out of hand. But that's an important thing, is that, you know, if something's really loud, like, try not to bring everything else up to its level. Instead, kind of bring things down and rebalance would be sort of my approach to something like that. And then, okay, so here we have this. So right at the beginning, you come in. So we have a few different parts that are sort of competing with each other. And the drums are a little bit better now. They're sitting at a nice volume. But for example, let's talk about these synths here. We've got the bass, which is almost all low end, right? That's like not a whole lot of high end info there at all, which is nice because it takes up a lot of its own space in the frequency range. Like if we pull up the EQ here, come on. My computer is working very hard right now. What with running the stream and whatnot. I should have paused this. There we go. Okay. So yeah, right here, you can see I've got some, again, this was actually a stereo file because there was a little bit of reverb in it from the producer. So I've got two different types of EQ here. And actually this is a good chance to kind of talk about this, where again, when you're EQing, a lot of times, like most of what I do is subtractive more than additive. So here specifically, I've got a few different bands. This one here, the high one, I'm basically cutting out just a bunch of stuff in sort of in the mids, lowish mids, because that's the space where I need my main synth to come through. If I turn this off, already it's crowding the main sort of pumping synth a little more now. Whereas we want there to be space, you know, just for the bass up the middle. And then we want those, you know, the rest of it to come through the sides. And then same deal here. Then we've got these leads that come in. Where basically here, I'm just kind of taming a little bit of around 1.6K. Because again, usually a lot of what I like to do at the first hand too, when I'm passing through, is basically find just super harsh, nasty frequencies and get rid of them. Because you just don't want that. There's like, there are certain ones that just like, that hurt, and anytime you know, anytime I hear something that's just sticking out as like being overly harsh, I'll get rid of it. So let's move into, here's the vocals here. Let's get started on that. So I'm just going to start this with a completely dry vocal. I've just got a little bit of tuning on it, but other than that, there's nothing going on here. And I'm sure too that vocals is something that a lot of you guys are going to be curious about. So I don't know when, but
never meant to harm you. I just wanted to help you.
All right, so that's, we can bring it up to an appropriate level.
You don't have to say sorry, and I don't want your money, but don't part away.
Okay, cool. It's there, it's balanced, yes, but we're not done with it because it sounds kind of, you know, it's just boring and it's just kind of there. So for vocals, I like to start with EQ. Let me get rid of this. That's a spoiler. First thing, like usually just some like, especially this like Neve style stuff like this. This is the Slate Digital Virtual Mix Rack. So I'll start here, just a little bit of a high shelf to give it some air. Vocals, I find, depending on the song and the instrument, the rest of the instrumentation, I'll sit it somewhere in the 1K range, kind of as the predominant area there. In this case, I've got it a little bit higher up, since this is a pop tune that's meant to be really, really, really bright. I've got that sort of set a little bit higher. And then I also hear, this is a high pass filter, which is basically just cutting out low end content. I have it going up to 131 Hertz right now because, again, I just don't need low end stuff in a pop mix like this, especially in the vocals, because, you know, if you think of a lot of the super polished kind of pop music, it's like it's just all sparkle for the most part. So I'll start with that, and immediately, so just watch as I A/B this
I never meant
here.
to harm you. I just wanted to help you. Nobody was treating you.
Immediately, it's still a little quiet, but
I never meant to
turn this
harm
on.
you.
We turn it off
Just
again.
wanted to help you. Nobody was treating you.
It pops out a little bit more. And then the next thing, as far as the sort of basic treatment for vocals, would be your compression. And what compression essentially is, I find that myself, when I was kind of growing up, tinkering around on my own, not knowing things, compression is one of those things where everybody's used it, but at a point where they didn't actually know what it was doing other than making things louder. But what compression actually is essentially the unit will have a certain threshold. Some compressors you can set it yourself, some it's default, and it's just kind of what it is. In the case of the one that I'm going to be using here, it's got its own set threshold. You can't change it. But basically, any audio signal that then passes over top of that threshold gets pulled down in level to balance it, to basically keep things from getting too loud, or to, for example, if you look here at the actual vocal track, you can see that the transients are kind of all over the place. It's pretty dynamic. So what this is going to do is take those sort of peaks at the top and bring them down so that the vocal is at a much more consistent level. And it just so happens to work out that when you do these types of things, it also just happens to give it a lot more smack, a lot more weight, and a lot more power once they're dialed in properly. As a rule of thumb, not really a rule of thumb, honestly, but just kind of for my own purposes, I usually like to go with some sort of 1176 style compressor. I usually use the CLA 76 from Waves as my main one. I actually kind of use a combination of the 2A and the 76. But in this case, again, let's get it dialed up. So we've got a few different controls here.
I never meant to harm you. I just wanted to help you.
So now this is with the compressor in.
Nobody was treating you right.
And the vocal's a little more forward now. You can hear it kind of coming more to the front. And let me turn it off and alternate it again.
I never meant to harm you. I just wanted to help you. Nobody was treating you right.
Tiny bit of that, but it's just got a little more weight to it. Let's listen without the music now. So no compression.
I never meant to harm you. I just wanted to help you.
With compression.
I never meant to harm you. I just wanted to help you. No.
Now I'm slamming it pretty hard here. But for this type of style, that's kind of what I like personally. But then let's move on to the next thing. So the vocal sits, it's there.
I never meant to harm you.
Right, much better than it was with no EQ, no compression. If we just turn that all off. But then the next thing is like, okay, now it just feels dry.
I never meant to harm you. Just wanted to help you.
You can hear it.
Nobody
pops out of the
was
mix,
treating you right.
but it's just almost uncomfortable. So for that, this is where we're going to use reverb. In most cases, and I know like something that happens a lot could be basically if you're putting a reverb or a spatial effect on a vocal or something like that. In most cases, again, before I learned my stuff, I would just take it, throw it right on the track, itself, and then kind of blend it, you know.
I never meant to harm you.
Like this.
I just wanted to help you. Nobody was
Something like this
treating
with
you right.
Fine sometimes, but as far as I usually typically go for reverbs and delays, especially, I won't put it directly on the track unless specifically it's meant to be a part of that actual sound of that element. So instead, this is where you want to get into using your buses. So let's see. Yeah, so I've already got a bus sent here. And what a bus is basically takes a copy of whatever you're routing through it and basically just plays it and then spits it out in parallel on another track. So in this case here, if you look at the bottom left, I've got my main vocal, and then that goes on bus 3, and then that auxiliary return is where I've got my vocal room, where I'm going to pick a different reverb real quick. So then here, I'm just going to crank it 100% wet, 0% dry, because now that means I have my own track at this point that I can use to turn reverbs up or down. And I'm going to get rid of the one that was on there.
Nobody was treating you right.
Now, to adjust my reverb
You don't
level,
have to say sorry, and I don't want your money,
I can just use it on
but
its own
don't
track.
part away from me.
And the thing that works nicely about that too is that anything else in the mix now that if I wanted to sort of share a space with that vocal, I can now send as well to that same reverb, and it's only, and then that kind of puts them again in the same sort of digital space, I'd say, rather than, you know, having a separate reverb for each track that's just causing a whole bunch of mud. But that's kind of the next thing for vocals, is that
I never meant to
I want to get your reverbs
harm
going.
you. I just wanted
I don't
to
know. Brian, what's your take on spatial effects and things like that in this context?
I guess it's probably, you know, mix specific. I tend to gravitate more towards delays than I do reverbs for creating space. I use slapback delay on vocals all the time, even if you can't hear it in my mix. It's kind of there, just sort of thickens and adds a bit of space without putting the vocalist in a room. But you know, like guitars, I'll use spring reverbs a little bit, and then definitely on vocals, I'll use like a short plate reverb. And then if there's any, like every once in a while, I'll want something to really stand out, so I might throw, because my mixes are usually pretty dry, I'll you know, I might run like a really long spring reverb and throw some guitars through it or something, just to kind of, you know, if I want to set something back in the mix. But I'm pretty like light on reverb.
You keep it dry
on my mixes.
Yeah, no, I like to, you know, this song's a little bit of an anomaly because there's a lot of space in it overall. But typically I like, especially for vocals, I like to use reverb. I'll usually actually do a delay into a reverb type thing.
I do that a lot.
Like a kind of a subtle slap or something that then is tamed by a reverb. But the bottom line is that I'll demonstrate a slapback now. I really like the repeater by I guess let's so
I never meant to harm you.
Yeah, let's get that going here. Let's get rid of the silver verb. Or wait, what's going on? Actually, turn the right bus on. Okay, so
I never meant to harm you.
That's a little extreme of a slap, but I'll make it mono for now as well, just so you can kind of hear it.
I never meant to harm you. I just wanted to help you. Nobody was treating you right. You don't have to say sorry.
And so you can hear there, right? The the slap too is also really nice for creating space behind.
I never meant to harm you. I just wanted to help.
Usually I like to pull these things to a point where I can hear it just subtly, and then I'll pull it down just a tiny bit more. Because I don't, again, with these types of effects, you want to make a very distinct kind of decision with effects in general, basically between deciding, do I want this to actually be an effect straight up as something like overt that people are supposed to really hear? Or is this meant to be just subtle flavor that's in there to create space and depth? You know, because if there would be cases maybe where again, I would want to make this just totally outrageous, right?
I never meant to harm you. I just wanted to help.
Right? In this case, it's kind of asinine to do it that way. But so I'd pull it down to like,
Nobody was treating you right. You don't have to say sorry, and I don't want your money.
one like that.
Part away from me, 'cause I know
Because at that point,
hard to face.
it's subtle, it's there, you can hear it, it's making a distinct difference, but it's also not super in the way and distracting. You're like, that's a slap delay, and that's all you can hear. You don't really want that. And then there's the next thing as far as moving forward in terms of just overall balance things, is kind of kick drum versus bass. The low end management is, you know, just a trial as old as time. But let's have a look at that real quick, because this is a good example of kind of subtractive EQ. So if we look at just the kick and the bass here. Oh, this is during a dropout, but so we get that going. The thing is that you want there to be a distinct difference in the low end between what's the bass and what the kick is. And so this is another reason for all of this EQ stuff. So here on my kick, for example, I'm giving just an absolute reef at 60 Hertz. And so then that's why over here on the bass, you can see I'm cutting 60 Hertz. And so basically what I'm doing there is carving a space out, and as well, these yellow cuts that you can see. Brian mentioned mid-side earlier. That's what's going on here, is that the gray cut here, for example, that is just taking a chunk out of, that's just processing the entire file, like all of the audio on that track. These yellow ones I have set so they're only doing these EQ moves in the center of the audio, which is where the kick sits. And again, in most cases, I would have, like, my basses would be mono. In this particular instance, it's stereo because there were some slight effects on it that the producer had. But so let's just for argument's sake, let's hear the difference between even just this one cut in the bass. So I might actually even be cutting a tiny bit too much, but right away when I activate this, you'll notice the kick gets a lot more powerful. Because it has more of its own space to exist. With kick drums too, you'll notice here as well, I've also just reefed the high end on this particular this one, mostly because in this case, I treat kick, you want to treat kick as almost two separate entities. There's the low end information, which is just all going to be just the bump and the rumble and the power. But, the thing with the kick is that, you, in order to cut through, is you actually want to focus on the high end of it just as much as the low end. Which is why you can really hear it coming through, because if I get rid of this shelf or dial that back, right, it pops out less and less the further I roll that back. As I bring it up, it becomes a little bit more present, and especially when there's kind of multiple layers and stuff. Because then we come back here,
I never meant to harm you. I just wanted to
you can actually still feel that high end from the kick popping through a little bit still.
You don't have to say sorry.
That delay is still too loud. But yeah, as far as kind of handling low end there, it's there's always negotiating the bass and the kick. And yeah, Brian, how do you approach that typically?
Usually at the start of the mix, I'll sort of decide what my approach will be. If I want to have a punchy kick and sort of a rounder, more bottom heavy bass, or if I want to have, sort of a bigger, more bottom heavy kick, then I'll do the opposite with the bass. And I just kind of decide, what a song needs.
Right.
Sort of right from the top, and then I'll just EQ accordingly.
Yeah,
I'm pretty goal oriented when I mix, so I like to. I'll take a listen to a rough mix a few times, and then kind of get my bearings and figure out how I want to approach. And usually, that's one of the first things that I'll tackle. Really, is how am I going to tackle the bottom end in the project? So.
I as far as especially with dealing with bottom end, because it's sort of an animal, do you find that there are certain kind of frequencies that you like to gravitate towards distinctly for kick and bass, or is it just kind of like whatever is recorded, what works best within the
I mean, it'll be sort of content dependent, but
yeah.
But I love Neve 1073 EQs, so the 60 hertz on a 1073 is always great, or the 110. So for bottom end information, I'm usually using that, or I'll throw sometimes I'll use multiple EQs to do different things. Like I'll use like a fab filter or the SSL, something that I can be a little more detail oriented in terms of doing any sort of cuts, and then I'll throw like the Neve on for color, or a Pultec even. So I like 60 hertz. I guess with my mixing style, I'm pretty heavy handed with the mix bus. I do a lot of work on my mix bus with various colorful plugins, and I am running through some analog, so it's so that kind of sets the tone for my overall mix, and then I can kind of just make little tweaks on my individual tracks as needed.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I just as far as I want to show one more thing off, because I have some guitars here that I want to kind of demonstrate what I like to do with those. Let me just get rid of the vocals here. So this is a little bit later in the song when again, usually I'd have a lot more reverb and stuff going here, but as far as guitars go, especially when you get more into high gain, it gets more involved, especially when you're sticking amps on, oh boy, when you're sticking amps on cabs and stuff like that, one of your main priorities is going to be just taming the high end, especially like the high mids in between like 2 to 5K ish. Usually there's going to be some annoying stuff in there. But then for guitars in general, like especially cleaner, tiny bit of compression, like barely any happening here, but and then again, like the big delay behind those for space. But yeah, like I've not got a whole lot going on these. These are fairly clean, but then let's look at this here. Yeah, so just a small pull down around 300 hertz because there's a giant spike there, as you can see, right? Which you can solo that by itself. It's just a really, really obnoxious frequency that's poking out, and then just a slight cut down here. And then in a case like this, especially in a heavier mix, and dealing with like a lot of electrics or anything like that, or higher gain stuff, I'd usually go into my guitar bus and or any stereo buses really. I like to go over those and then cut space out for my vocals around like wherever the lower frequency is in the vocals, like which is a spike somewhere between could be between 100 to 250-ish hertz or so, and then also where the high end of the vocal pops through, which is again somewhere between 1 to 2K, anywhere in that range, again content dependent. But to really create space for a vocal, I like to go through my various stereo elements and buses and specifically use mid side EQ to carve that middle space out, so that the vocal can sit everywhere throughout the mix, because that's kind of usually the most important thing, is getting the vocal to sit in most cases. But yeah, as far as the demo goes and that type of stuff for now, let's call it there, and I'll answer some questions. Let me pull the chat up. So yeah, and again, that was very baseline, and again, it could get a lot more in depth. But those are sort of just some of the basic principles for getting started with it. Because usually, especially if you don't really have much context in terms of what goes into the mixing process, it can be kind of daunting knowing which things to start with. But slight vocal things, but those are the main things. It's like vocals, kind of how to get those sitting where you want them to. Spatial effects and using buses is an important one. And then also things again like managing your low end, balancing your kick and bass against each other, and just managing your frequency spaces, basically. Subtractive EQ is your friend, and then you can do additive bumps in other places, but for the most part, a lot of mixing is, honestly, kind of think about it that way, is just cleaning things up. But let's see, let's go over some questions here. Okay, so firstly, I guess from Tishil, I don't know, Brian, are you in your mix room right now?
I am. Yes, my basement mix room. Although you can't see, it doesn't look like it, but I am.
I would be able to. Hashil asked if you could show us around.
That might be tough, just because
Okay.
my laptop is is connected to a million things.
Okay, fair enough.
Unless I can get in on my phone. Hold on.
Okay.
I might be able to do that.
All right.
Let me see.
Okay, let's see. Paige Warner asks, what would you say are the top 3 things for someone to learn when just beginning to start mixing?
What would the top 3 things?
Your top 3, yeah.
When you're starting mixing? I think I think the first thing is just to do it as much as possible. Just throw yourself into the fire and just go with it. Something that I find useful I'll recommend to people that are starting out is to use references.
Yeah.
So if you've got, if you're mixing, a rock song that maybe is like a modern take on classic rock, then like maybe you listen to like a Rival Sons song or something like that, just to sort of give you an idea of how a pro mix will sound, and you can kind of use that to judge your bottom end and your top end. I'll do it sometimes now too, especially when I'm mixing. I've spent my whole career mixing in rock, but for the most part, but I have been recently mixing like country and hip hop.
Oh yeah, that's cool. And that's like the country.
So I use references.
Yeah, and that's cool too, because it kind of gets more into the like really organic stuff. But yeah, that was kind of what I was gonna say too, is like, aside from, there's the slight technical things where you just kind of want to learn your effects, learn what compression is, learn what chorus is it, what chorus effects is, what flanging is. If you know what your effects are, you can basically just kind of do whatever with anything, because you know what the tools are and have an understanding of how they work rather than just what they do. But other than that, just listen to music. Like, actively listen to music with a frame of mind of like, I'm trying to discern exactly what's going on here. That's kind of for me what I always found helpful, is just to listen with intent, I'd say.
Another thing, and it's sometimes like, especially when you only have an hour to talk about the fundamentals of mixing, but it gets overlooked a lot, is simple volume settings and panning. Like, so much space can be created in a mix just by how you set your levels and where you pan them in the stereo field, as well as automation. Like, for me, automation is a massive part of the mixing process, where I can control the dynamics of my entire song. So like a song, and a lot of times the producer will do this, where they the choruses have added tracks, so they jump out and maybe the bridge breaks down a bit, and then the last chorus has some additional elements that pop out. Sometimes I don't have that, and I have to kind of create that feeling, so that when a listener's listening to the song, there's movement within the song, and the song is growing, and then subtracting and growing and subtracting until so that you sort of take the listener on a journey, and all of that can be accomplished without even using effects. Just definitely, just the balancing is super important. And like, that's going back to the listening thing, just kind of listen through a record or listen through a playlist of songs kind of within a certain style, and just pay attention to, like, generally, where the kick sits relative to everything else, where the snare sits relative to everything else. And even just that in itself, volume wise, is a good frame of reference. Let's see. Kevin says, can you give some tips regarding applying EQ and compression to your final mix? So I'm assuming that would be on the stereo bus, on the actual output. Basically, I'll start with compression is one of those deals where you very much to taste, but with your bus compression, the idea generally is to sort of glue the whole thing together and just take, because by leveling off a certain bit of the loudest parts of it, again, it's squishing everything down into itself, is kind of the best way that I can describe that. And so that's sort of what the idea of bus compression is. And then with EQs, for example, you can basically just kind of, clean up any residual stuff that might be left over from your tracks. Usually I try to do as much as I can in the mix itself. And then there's stuff like multi-band compression to just, again, tidy up extraneous frequencies popping out or things like that. I don't know. You said you do a lot with the mix bus, so. I use a lot of plugins on my mix bus, but they're all doing very little. So It's like, but just there's certain combinations of plugins I like the sound of. So like, I'll usually have a tape emulator at the start of my plugin, at the start of my mix bus. So it just, the Studer A800 UAD plugin I love. So it just just gives a little bit of analog and also a bit of compression, and then and then I'll follow it up by a compressor. Usually, well, it changes, either like a Neve 33609 or an SSL. The one thing I will say with compressing the mix bus is all the dynamics I talked about, in terms of automating, you can almost ruin by, applying too much compression on your mix bus. So for me, I like it when the needle's barely moving. But
Right.
it's also because I compress a lot on my individual tracks
Before you even get there, yeah.
before I get there. So it doesn't, my mixes don't need a ton of compression on the mix bus. And then I usually use like, I'll use like a Pultec style EQ on my mix bus, just so I like the tone of it. So a lot of times the Manly Massive Passive, which is like a 4-band Pultec basically. So it's got your lows, low mids, high mids, and highs. And it just, usually I start each mix with similar settings and then I'll tweak it towards the end of the mix. But for me, it's important because I do use a fair amount of effects that I mix into my mix bus, meaning that from the start of the mix, all my tracks go through my mix bus settings.
Yeah.
And that to me is like kind of makes the sound of what a traditional mixing board may have sounded like,
Yeah.
So
yeah, like for example, with the virtual mix rack Slate's whole thing, like I really like, I've become religious about having that on every track with the virtual console on there.
Yeah.
And then having the mix bus part of it on the stereo out, because then it actually is just like that. This sounds like an SSL. And it's really cool. Let's see. Claire says, I record with an omnidirectional sort of starter mic, and I've never used any sort of panning before, but it seems like might be good to learn. Can you talk a bit about what a beginner should know about using panning tools? Have fun, but don't be too ridiculous with it, I suppose. It's one of those things where it's more with panning. I think it's more about kind of just finding what should fit where in terms of contextually. But yeah, Brian, I'll let you take this one.
Yeah, to me, I mean, I'm a big fan, like I said earlier, of mids, like your center and your sides. So I'm pretty heavy-handed when it comes to panning. Like, I'm not afraid to pan big guitars left and right, hard left and hard right.
Yes.
I like that sort of stereo imaging. I like, when I listen to Rolling Stones records, I like that I can hear Keith Richards on one side and
or it's like
Mick Taylor or Ronnie Woods on the other. Like
Angus on the right, Malcolm on the left.
Yeah, I mean that stuff is, and then when in doing that, it really clears space for your vocal in the center and the bass in the center. And then I'll pan. I try to keep things away from the center as much as possible.
Yes.
Other things other than kick, snare, bass, and lead vocal. The odd time I'll throw a lead guitar in the center if I have to and EQ it, but I tend to work away from the sides back in a little bit with some of my overdubs. But things kind of on the sides will go from 50% to 100%, and then I just sort of leave the center. It also creates kind of wide sounding stereo mixes without having to play with the width.
It's nice too, like something like I'm doing another track right now that's got just a pile of guitars. It'll be like, something subtle where like the first layer in the verse, they're at like, I don't know, 40 each. And then when the next layer comes in, they're at like 45, 46.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. Basically, I guess, like you have your traditional stuff that you'd have up the middle. And then for panning though, it's all about one of those things where it's kind of a balance between just kind of creating space for things. Because, you can do, or like, if you're doing like a certain lead guitar part, for example, you pan that to the left or off to the left a little bit. And then if you want to complement it, balance that, you could say, do a keyboard piano part or something of a similar nature, put that on the right side to balance them out or something like that. But it definitely just kind of mess around with it. You okay to answer a couple more?
Yeah, of course.
Cool. Jordan says, would you advise visually EQing rather than just going by ear? That one, it's kind of, trust your ears more than anything. And definitely take, you know, the more you do it, and somebody else asked something similar about it, was basically like, oh yeah, how do you hear kind of differences or start to hear the subtle changes in compression and EQ and things like that? Just by doing it, really. The more you do it, the more you practice, the more you'll just start to be able to kind of detect what frequencies are where and whatnot. But the visuals are just there to be helpful, basically. But trust your ears. I don't know. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, when I started, I mean, I didn't have any visual, any visuals, so I was all by ear. I do find, you know, there are plugins that are super helpful. And I'll have like a spectrum analyzer on my mix bus nowadays, so I can see, you know, what's going on with my bottom end and top end sort of overall.
Yeah.
Just helps me, you know, if just kind of solidifies what my ears are hearing. It's almost like the visual is a reinforcement, but a lot of times I'll just like look away or close my eyes and listen and really focus on what I'm hearing. And I've learned over, you know, 20 years to trust my ears. You know, that like if my ears are telling me something's wrong, then something is wrong, you know, or if my ears are happy, then usually my clients will be happy too. So.
Yeah, cool. Srikanth asked as well about basically balancing sort of the roles of the artist, the producer, the engineer, kind of throughout that. To me, it basically, you know, it can be super dependent. Sometimes you're mixing, you're receiving something from somebody else and you're just mixing it. In most cases for me, I produce and record the stuff that I mix as well. But yeah, I guess in your cases, like if you're receiving something from, you know, from a producer or working with a producer and you're just mixing it, like how does the delegation work there?
Yeah, I mean it's funny because I don't know, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when I was working, there was more of a defined, like, the recording process has ended, now we're going to mix. And these days I find a lot of even producers that aren't mixers are doing some mixing as they go, you know, and so I'll get, you know, a lot of times the rough mixes I get and the Pro Tools sessions, you know, with mixes, I'll always ask for, you know, all the rough mix material, because I know that that's sort of a starting point. That's what the producer was sort of hearing and the band was hearing and they're happy with. So then it's really my job, again, going back to what I said at the beginning, of just enhancing and correcting sometimes, you know, what's there and imparting my, I guess, personal taste. But a lot of it's a lot of collaboration. You know, I find I find like music is great when you collaborate. You know, some of the best music, you know, of all time are just collaborations. You know, Lennon and McCartney, Jagger and Richards. Like it's all, you know, it's working with people, and to the point nowadays where it's like almost over collaborated. But I definitely like to, you know, I kind of like to have the opportunity to take a first stab at a mix. You know, go with what I'm hearing, what my gut is telling me to do with the project, and then send it to the band and the producer, and then get feedback. And if I'm like off the mark, then, you know, they'll let me know and they'll sort of give their input. But a lot of times I'm getting hired because there's a sound that producer and the band are looking for, and so they come to me for that, what I do.
And like, I'd imagine usually what you're getting is already pretty close.
Sometimes not.
Okay.
You'd be surprised.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of and some of the sort of bigger bands, and like a lot of people are recording on their own, you know, doing like maybe they'll do beds in a big studio with, you know, amazing gear, and then they'll go and do overdubs like in their home studios. So, you know, so I am dealing with, you know, files that, you know, have different sonics, and but I've got ways of making everything sound tight and enhanced.
Oh man, these are a lot of really good ones. Let's see. Marcelo just asked about clarifying the roles of the producer, engineer, and mixer and master. So basically, producer is the boss. The producer is the kind of the person who will be in charge of a project or sort of overseeing and managing it. And so usually the producer will be the person that, say, books the mixer, or in most cases, sometimes the producer will also be, will also mix it. When you just kind of refer to somebody as an engineer, that they do the actual recording. They're responsible for the actual tracking session that happens. The mixer takes the recorded stuff and mixes it, and then mastering is basically a final stage of polishing that happens after the mix, where 9 times out of 10 the mastering engineer will be working with just the stereo mix itself, just a print of that. Sometimes they'll get track outs, but that's kind of rare in my experience. But mastering is the final part of the process, where it's kind of just finalizing it for whatever medium it's going to. And then any advice for home studio people mixing on headphones only? Just get to know what your headphones sound like. And that same can be said with speakers too. Just get to know what they sound like, and kind of once you understand the characteristics of what you're listening to, you can kind of identify when something is wrong on something else. It's one of those interesting things. But yeah, just get to know what your headphones sound like. Try other headphones and then sort of see how that compares to yours. So then that'll kind of be a helpful way to discern, like, okay, this is what my headphones are doing that I'm used to. I don't know, that's sort of what worked for me to learn my stuff, is just use it a lot and compare it to other things, and then be kind of like, okay, this is what this is, and this is what this is. I don't know, but I guess with your speakers and stuff, like a similar deal.
Yeah, I tend not to mix with headphones all that often, just because it confuses me, because I have never really done it, and to have the music so close to my head, like I do like to have the space, and I kind of like to. This sounds weird, but to judge the bottom end, sometimes like if I just touch my desk, like I can feel the bottom end, and I know like if there's too much or too little, especially in subs. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a weird thing, but it's like the old looking at the woofers and NS10s and seeing the movement and judging how much bottom there are, or there is in the speaker. But anytime I think you're right. You just have to listen as much as possible. What I tend to do is, there's some songs that I know like intimately well that I'll just throw up in a room on speakers and have a listen, and quickly I can kind of calibrate my head to the room.
Yeah, that's actually another one that I would say is, if you have if there's certain songs that you're really familiar with and kind of totally understand what you're used to hearing from them, play that through a system, and then immediately you'll be like, okay, you'll be able to identify like what sounds weird to you or things like that. Okay, we'll do couple more, just quick fire these and then wrap it up. Automation at the beginning before using compression, like on the vocals, for example, or as a final step. Automation is kind of just all over the place, because you can automate literally anything in the entire session, pretty much, from volume on a track to like the attack knob on a compressor you can change. So in terms of automation, usually let's just put it wherever it needs to go, in however you need to use it. That's a tough one, because automation is so huge in terms of what you can do with it.
I think in terms of like just volume changes, I would do it after I compress, just because if you do it before, then you're going to just run your automation into the compressor, and it's going to kind of negate your, all the automation you've done. So but you're right. Like these days, everything is automatable. So it's like constantly automating.
Yeah. The way that I like to think
on and off, and just crazy things.
From a volume standpoint, though, I like to think of automation as basically being like just specifically controlling the output overall of that track. Okay. And then let's see. Does the type of DAW really matter? Not really. If you're on, let's see, on GarageBand for iPad, yeah, like honestly, just spend time with it and get used to using it. As far as, I'm not sure what the availability of plugins is on mobile, but I know this got all of like Logic's or GarageBand's like stock effects and stuff in there, and they'll work just fine to learn your fundamentals as far as using effects and stuff. What does your master stereo? Yeah, what does your master output chain usually comprise, and what order? So I guess we kind of went over that a little bit. Pro Tools or Logic for a beginner? That's a difficult one. I'd probably go with Logic, but the thing with DAWs is that basically they all have their own quirks. I've found that learning Pro Tools made me better at Logic, because fundamentally they all sort of do the same thing in just a different way. But I use both, so I can't really answer that question.
I think it depends what you want to do.
Yeah.
You know, like I know I don't use Logic all that much, so I'm you know, I've almost my whole career been in Pro Tools. But you know, if you're more of a singer-songwriter, I think Logic is a better, you know, or a songwriter. You don't have to be a singer.
Yeah.
But I think it's probably a better DAW, you know, in that there's lots of great built-in instruments, and the way it's laid out is more conducive, I think, to creative songwriting. Whereas if all you want to do is like be a mixer or an engineer, then Pro Tools is the way to go. Yeah,
that's kind of the way that I look at it. Like I prefer using Pro Tools for when I'm doing big sessions and like doing drum sessions, or if I'm in a studio. But if I'm just writing or coming up with stuff or doing just like one of my smaller one mic sessions, I'll use Logic. Okay. As far as if you only have voice memos, you're recording from instruments, how do you use it? Basically, I think there should be a way on the iPhone. I've never tried it myself. I would think you can bounce your voice memos into GarageBand somehow. I think they'd let you do that. But and then let's see. How do you deal with phasing in a mix?
We could have a 2-hour conversation.
Yeah, that one.
That's a good question.
Just try not to have it in the first place is my best answer there.
Yeah, I get, like, it's funny because you like a lot of time, like phasing will occur, you know, if you have multiple mics on a single instrument, or if you're using like a bass DI and a bass amp, or, you know, if you have multiple mics on a drum kit, you know, so a lot of times, like, I'll spend while I'm starting a mix, I'll go through all my tracks and see if there's any phasing issues between, you know, different microphones on the same instrument. And sometimes, like, I'm not afraid, you know, if a producer sends me guitars that, you know, had 4 mics on a, you know, on a cabinet, I might choose the best sounding one and not use the others.
Right.
You know, yeah. I might just, because if the phase is all wrong, then it's not going to sound very impactful. It'll sound hollow. I won't have enough bottom end. So sometimes it's best just to choose that one mic or 2 mics. And other times, you know, I have to move the WAV files around a little bit to line them up so that I'm not dealing with phase issues. Because you know, and especially when you're dealing with kick and bass, I think the general rule that I find is if you start having issues EQing something, you know, if you're like really having to boost like a ton of bottom end or a ton of top end on the kick and you're not really hearing it, then it's most likely that there's phase issues between the kick and some other microphone on the drum kit.
Claire, just to clarify, phasing is basically, to boil it down as much as possible, it has to do with time discrepancies between 2 signals of similar audio. Kind of. So for example, if you were to record, say, 2 microphones on a guitar cabinet or on an acoustic guitar, and one mic is like slightly further away, than the other, there's going to be a time discrepancy in the recordings between those two microphones. And it's basically going to cause, like, imagine, I don't know, think of a sound that's like sludgy, but not, I don't even know. It's just not a nice sound.
It's usually hollow sounding.
Yeah.
Because a lot of it gets rid of a lot of the low mids. But on the, like, sometimes it's cool. Like if you're recording a guitar and you have, you know, if I have a close mic and a room mic, a lot of times that will be fine. But if I've mic'd the cabinet with two mics and one is like an inch or two further back than the close one, then usually I'll have some problems.
Yeah. But anyway, I think we'll wrap it up there. In the chat, I've just left my email address. So if anybody has any further questions, feel free to email me. And I will get back to you and answer those. Within the next few days, the recording of this will be up, will be available as well. And yeah, we'll have some additional resources as well with that coming your way. But again, thanks to everybody for coming. It was a lot of really great questions. And you know, I'm happy to answer more of those. Brian, thank you so much for hanging out.
Hey, no problem. And if you don't mind, if any of you are interested, I ran a master class last month, a mixed master class, and which was very successful, and I plan on doing it again in the summer. So if you just go to moncarsmixmasterclass.com, you can find my email there if you have any questions, and you can sign up for more information. And I'll be updating the site shortly with a new class.
Awesome. That's great. Looking forward to that then. But yeah, thanks again. Mike, thanks for doing the intro. And yes, everybody have a lovely day, and you know, happy mixing. I hope you were able to get something useful out of this. But anyway, from NWC webinars, I'm Andrew Leyenhorst. Brian, thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Everybody take care.